if we could take all the best attributes from all the different diets in the world that have longer lifespan? What if we didn't try to look at it all as one blanket piece, but we exploited specific benefits from different regions, right? If we look at even the blue zones, we can't just say they all do the same thing. They do some of the same things, but a lot of them do things very different. So maybe we can extract benefits from Costa Rica, we can extract benefits from Sardinia, we can extract benefits from Greece, and we combine them to make the perfect longevity diet. So what is the best diet for longevity? Let's break it down. The funny thing is that you can find benefits or dangers in just about everything. Every style of diet, every little bit of food. Like you can talk about a grapefruit and find a benefit to it and also find a danger to it if you really want to. And then when you start looking at the bio-individual piece, then it gets really complicated to figure out what is good for somebody and what is not, right? How you metabolize and extract nutrients from food is going to be different from how I do. But there are things that are also common denominators. So what I do want to focus on, although it gets picked apart occasionally, is the blue zones. Okay, now the blue zones are recognized because they have longer lifespans, right? There's a large number of people that are living into their 90s and over 100. So we have regions like Okinawa, Japan, we have Costa Rica, we have Sardinia in Italy, we have Greece, and then we have Loma Linda in California. Now, there's a few things. Now, if we look at the original study that really broke it down, there's 9 common denominators, but I want to be able to take it deeper than that because these common denominators really focused on lifestyle, which I believe is the bigger piece of the puzzle, not just the diet. But the American Journal of Lifestyle Medicine chronicled the 9 hallmarks within this as moving naturally. Okay, so most of these people within these regions don't drive around a lot. They walk a lot. They garden a lot. They work in their yards. They do their own work, right? There's a lot of labor involved. They also found that they belong. And what I mean by that is a lot of them were faith-based, but even if they're not, they belonged to a community. And that community played a very big role in their drive to move forward in life. They tend to put loved ones first. They keep their family very, very close. And then they also belong to the right tribe. So they surround themselves with a social circle that pushes positive peer pressure on them. Whereas in a lot of Western culture and how we are now, we have a lot of peer pressure to do the wrong thing, right? Drugs, alcohol, unhealthy habits, bad eating habits, etc. They also live with purpose. So they found that most of the blue zone groups, when they wake up in the morning, they have intention. Maybe it's something small, maybe it's something huge, who cares? They have purpose. But they also, what they call, quote, downshift. Okay, like groups in Italy and Greece, they take naps, right? Some of the other groups like Okinawans, they have more social time. The Loma Linda group, they have very structured, like faith-based time together that they consider to be very relaxing and downshifting time. And then when we get into the diet piece, almost all groups stop eating at about 80% satiety. So they don't eat until they're totally gorged and full. They also eat high amounts of fiber, which is interesting. We'll talk more about this. And they drink moderate amounts of wine. Okay, so we're going to talk about this stuff. So let's talk diet now. Let's get into the nitty-gritty of it because it's pretty cool. So like I mentioned, they eat to about 80% satiety. They don't eat to 100%. But generally speaking, when you look at these groups, they're all consuming about a 10 to 15% deficit on average. And they do it effortlessly. Okay, so they're consuming less calories than they're expending, which you probably know from some of my videos that you may have watched. That induces autophagy and cellular recycling and sort of a survival of the fittest attribute within your body. You don't have to be fasting. You can just be in a caloric deficit and you can get similar benefits. Although I'm biased with fasting because it worked so well for me when I lost 100 pounds, and I like to share that with people. So don't fault me for that. There was a study that was published in the journal Maturitas that found that lower calories, eating in a deficit, was associated with less cardiovascular disease risk as well as less inflammation. These are 2 things that we absolutely need to be paying attention to as we move on, as we get a little bit older, right? And additionally, consuming less calories, whether it be through fasting or just eating less, that can increase what is called FOXO. Okay, FOXO or FOXO3 is a gene that gets expressed that is associated with increasing antioxidant production in the body. Okay, so when you increase or upregulate FOXO, your body has more of an ability to scavenge ROS, okay, reactive oxygen species, free radicals. So it can deal with that better, but it also can increase the expression of genes that are associated with DNA repair. So as we get older, DNA repair becomes very, very important because we have more cells that are getting damaged and more DNA that's getting damaged, and it needs to get repaired. So if we increase the genes that are associated with DNA repair, perhaps we have a better lifespan, or perhaps we have a better health span. Now, another thing that we look at is all of these groups are relaxed, right? They're pretty relaxed groups throughout these blue zones. Well, eating in a mild deficit, again, through fasting or just a 15% general deficit now and then, also plays a role in what is called the sympathetic to parasympathetic balance. Basically, they can switch from being in a sympathetic stress situation to very relaxed, very fast. Better heart rate variability and ultimately lower resting heart rate. They have the ability to adapt to stress, and their cardiovascular system can adapt to stress and come back to baseline very fast. Compare that to some people that we may know that get stressed out and they stay stressed out for 10 days, right? So it doesn't mean that you need to be in a deficit all the time, but you should exercise the right to be in a deficit as much as you can, and then balance that with times that you're in a surplus, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a tactical sense in a minute. Let's look at a few of the different regions here and take some hallmarks from each of them. So starting with Okinawa, Japan, their main hallmark that's really interesting about them is a high fiber content. Okay, now what's interesting with Okinawa is in World War II, or after World War II, they diverged from the rest of Japan. A lot of Japan started becoming more industrialized and consuming a lot more in the way of refined processed starches and a heck of a lot more rice. The Okinawans ate a lot more native. So what they do is they consume a lot of purple potatoes, they consume a ton of sweet potatoes, and they consume a lot of things like Brussels sprouts, and they consume these veggies and fibers, but a lot of these sweet potatoes. Now, what's so interesting about sweet potatoes in particular? Well, sweet potatoes are what is called a resistant starch, which means that it's resistant to digestion. So that means it stays in the gut a little bit longer, and it acts as fodder, as fuel, as fertilizer for the gut bacteria. This becomes very important because the gut bacteria feed and then they do what's called cross-feeding on things like resistant starches. This creates a lot of what is called butyrate. Now, butyrate is a short-chain fatty acid that is responsible for nourishing the epithelial cells, the cells within our gut. Okay, so what that means is we have a healthier gut, which means we perhaps have better nutrient utilization, nutrient absorption, just a healthier gut in general. But also, these short-chain fatty acids can play a tremendous role in glucose control, glucose modulation, how our cells use fuel. So what happens in our gut is very powerful, not to mention having a much more diverse microbiome. So Okinawans, considering how much fiber and how much resistant starch they eat, they have a diverse microbiome. Now, there was a study that was published in Nature that demonstrated that a diverse microbiome is probably more important than any one particular species. It is way too embryonic for us to ever say that one species is going to make you have a better health span, lifespan. But it is a lot easier for us to say, hey, when we look at the observational data, a diverse diet, a diverse amount of fiber, and a diverse microbiome is very, very good overall. So consuming a lot of sweet potatoes. Now, I know a lot of people that watch my channel do a lower carb protocol. That's fine. You don't have to eat sweet potatoes every day, but when you do introduce carbohydrates in, they should be the right ones. Sweet potatoes, they eat a lot of legumes. They eat a lot of lentils, things like that. Then also consume things like asparagus, like Brussels sprouts, like artichoke that are rich in these inulin fibers that do the same kind of thing. Okay? And you don't have to do them every day. Again, if you're doing low carb, or keto, or whatever, cycle them in instead of the rice, instead of the starches, right? Instead of the grains. It can make a difference based on the data. And when it comes to the diverse microbiome, people ask about a probiotic. I put a link for my favorite probiotic. It's called Seed. I don't really take probiotics a whole lot, with the exception of Seed, because they're actually rooted in science and they really have some scientific rigor behind what they do, and they put their money where their mouth is, and they fund their own studies and they do their own research, and that's what I am all about and what I respect and represent. So I put a link down below. Cool technology with a capsule inside of a capsule, so you're getting proper staging of the prebiotic and the probiotic. It's called a Synbiotic. So that link down below is a 15% off discount link. Don't have to do it. I'm just saying when we're looking at the big picture holistically, it might be something cool to check out in addition to changing up your diet. So that link is down below. And again, that code Thomas15 15 will save you 15% off your entire order with Seed Daily Synbiotic down below. Another interesting thing that the Okinawans do that you could add into your diet is they eat a lot of seaweed. Now, this is interesting because we know seaweed's beneficial because of iodine and the minerals, but it goes beyond that. There's a study that was published in the journal Food Science that found that seaweed actually acts as an ACE inhibitor. Maybe you've heard of pharmaceuticals that are ACE inhibitors, right? So this can be hugely beneficial when it comes down to the cardiovascular system. But in addition to that, an ACE inhibitor can also inhibit the breakdown of glucagon-like peptide 1. What this simply means in human terms is it allows the pancreatic beta cells to produce insulin easier. Therefore, it has a metabolic effect so that our cells aren't just getting bombarded by glucose that it can't use. It helps the pancreas produce insulin so the cells can actually use glucose rather than our glucose getting sky high and potentially causing damage there. So we've extracted that from the Okinawan region. Now let's look at Costa Rica for a second. Costa Rica has a couple hallmarks that are somewhat different from the other regions. Now, all the regions have a lot of sunshine, but Costa Rica is very much closer to the equator. So sunshine becomes a huge, huge component here, as well as moderate amounts of fruit, which is wild because if we look at too much fruit, it can potentially be detrimental. But if you look at some studies, particularly one that was published in Circulation, they found that looking at 42,000 people that consumed fruit instead of other like sugary treats or consumed moderate amounts of fruit tended to live longer. They had a lower risk of mortality. That doesn't mean that you go and you eat a dozen bananas or even 3 bananas for breakfast. It means maybe a little bit of fruit now and then is something that can prevent you from indulging in the Snickers bar. Okay, so it's something to factor in. Now, if you're doing keto, again, it doesn't necessarily work, but you can implement it later on when you are having carbs, because I'm a big fan of cycling things. And when we get to the end of this video, I'll put together a playbook, but you have to have the education here. I can't just give you the details on what to do without explaining everything. Interestingly enough, in Costa Rica, they eat a lot of papaya. Now, papaya has what are called saponins in it. Now, saponins can delay the gastric emptying and affect the glycemic load of other carbohydrates they eat. So since they have a lot of papaya with different meals, the saponins actually slow the digestion of those other carbohydrates, which may have a positive impact metabolically on their glucose. So this is a huge thing because the kind of fruit does matter. They also don't go overboard. They might have a half a papaya along with some breakfast or something, right? But then we look at the sun. They get a lot of sun and they're very social, and they're very social in the morning with their son. And there was a study that was published in the American Journal of Psychiatry that found that 15 to 30 minutes of direct sun exposure in the morning dramatically increased mood. Now, we know that it increases mood. Okay, another thing that it does is it highlights the circadian rhythm to be in proper function. So if you go out in the morning and you get a lot of sunlight, 15, 30 minutes of sunlight in the morning, it tells the body, hey, this person is awake, and it recalibrates the circadian rhythm, leading to better, deeper sleep, leading to better eating patterns, leading to ultimately more vitamin D synthesis. You open up a whole can of worms with different benefits. I'm huge. Sunlight is my new obsession. I've been obsessed with going out and treating sunlight like a vitamin. I need to go take my vitamin, I go out in the sun. Try to do it in the morning though. Now we also see that a lot of the world is deficient in vitamin D. If you look at the Okinawans, they're getting a lot more vitamin D from the sun. It's just something to ponder there. So we start adding these different factors in, right? Now we move into an interesting region. This one's wild because it's the Loma Linda region, and it is a faith-based group, Adventist, and they are vegan. So is Thomas saying that I need to be vegan? No, I'm not, because these other groups eat meat. They eat it in moderation, they don't go overboard, but they get sufficient protein. They get where they need to be. The Loma Linda group is vegan, yet they still are part of this blue zone group. The reason that I mention this is because it highlights that it's probably the other factors of life that are superseding and overshadowing the diet. The diet is important, but the Loma Linda group goes to show us right here and there that we have one group that eats meat, one group that doesn't eat meat, one group that eats more meat, one group that doesn't eat meat at all, one group that eats more fish, one group that eats no fish at all. And they all collectively live for longer periods of time, which tells us that it's not diet specific. Perhaps, and this is purely perhaps hypothetical, the Loma Linda group would live even longer if they also added some meat in. Who knows, right? I can't say with certainty, but it tells us these lifestyle factors like the social life, the sunlight, the relaxation, the sleep, those are probably even more important. I think if we can learn from consuming protein in other groups how to get the right amount of protein along with the high amount of fiber that the Loma Linda group gets, maybe we can enhance it even more. But again, it's way too early to tell. Now, if we look at the Sardinia and the Greece zones, very interesting because their meat consumption is much more fish, right? They have fruta de mare, they have all kinds of different, shellfish, they have calamari, they have fish, right? So their omega-3 content might be a little bit higher, which is interesting because omega-3s are very, very good for what is called membrane fluidity. Okay, they help the cells have a softer membrane that is able to communicate with other cells. Cells being able to communicate with one another is so unbelievably important. Very critical overall for, well, communication and for cells to know when it's time to have a apoptosis, go through cell death, or maybe time to go through autophagy, or maybe for nutrients to get in through that membrane. So very, very important there. Also, they consume a lot of olive oil, which I'm obsessed with too. Okay, olive oil, yes, solid monounsaturated fat, very, very good fat, but it converts into something called OEA, oleoethanolamine. Now, what OEA does is it can increase levels of brown fat. It increases what is called uncoupling protein 2, which, to make a long story short, when you have higher levels of uncoupling protein 2 within the mitochondria, it fully uncouples, and that means that it allows the neutralizing of reactive oxygen species. Now, in the 1990s, we thought that reactive oxygen species and oxidative stress were the primary causes of aging. We know that's not necessarily the truth now, but we do know that ROS and these oxidative stressors are a problem if they're out of control. And increasing brown fat and increasing uncoupling protein 2 specifically, not uncoupling protein 1 that is a partial uncoupler, but increasing UCP2, we can potentially neutralize more reactive oxygen species. Very, very important. So we look at, okay, olive oil, avocado oil, we look at the omega-3 rich fish and the protein they consume being very interesting. Also, a little less on the red meat consumption, right? And the red meat that they do consume is typically lean. Now, I'm not here to say saturated fat is bad, but I am here to say that perhaps if we lean towards the leaner cuts of meat and add more of the olive oil and the avocado oil, things like that, and perhaps we can take some lessons from these different regions, right? So how do we put it all together? Because you can't necessarily eat in a deficit forever, right? You'd waste away. But you also have to have a balance of when you eat more. This is why I feel like if you combine a lot of what we are learning here with sort of a time-restricted feeding approach, it allows you to have the best of both worlds. Because with fasting and caloric restriction, we get all these recycling benefits that are very important, very, very, very important, okay? But with feasting, we get growth, we get mTOR, we get memory formation in the hippocampal region of the brain, we get muscle growth. We need these things. We cannot deny, we can't be in autophagy all the time, otherwise what is there left to autophagy, right? So with this, we think, okay, periodic fasting or periodic low carb to be able to drive up autophagy and drive down mTOR, followed by maybe a feasting mechanism, like a feasting time, where a couple days a week you eat in a surplus. So you eat the kinds of foods we're talking about. You eat maybe lower carb, less refined, high fruit, high veggie, things like that are all good and healthy, right? I say that sort of with air quotes because who knows, right? But being able to put yourself in a deficit to control those insulin levels and then have a periodic surplus so that you still get the pro-growth signals, but your overall net caloric deficit is 5 to 15% over the course of a week, that's what we're after. So lean cuts of meat and a lot more poultry and a lot more fish, okay, that seems to be a big piece there. I think if we can eat more of the fish and the smaller fish, like the shrimp and the things that are sustainable, the clams, the mussels, the shellfish, things like that, very, very good sources of protein and rich in minerals that we need. Adding seaweed into the diet, also a big piece. If you can't add that in, that's fine, but maybe go for the lean poultry and that option instead of the seafood and the seaweed. High fiber is the big piece, and I don't care if you're low carb or not. Getting the Brussels sprouts, getting the artichokes, getting the inulin in. And if you don't like eating a ton of vegetables like that, at least consume some ghee, okay? G-H-E-E. Ghee is clarified butter, essentially, that still is rich in the short-chain fatty acids that are good for the gut. It's the next best thing, but realistically, diverse fiber, profile is going to help with that diverse microbiome. And if you're doing lower carb or you're doing fasting, it works out great. Lower carb, 1 or 2 days a week, really go high on the fiber, and then go back to your lower carb approach. Sunlight as much as you can. Treat it like a vitamin, really. Okay, live your life with intention with that. Okay, treat it like food, because the way that you synthesize it in your body is very, very similar to the way that you consume food and get vitamin D. So go outside, eat your lunch outside. Set a timer and go out there for 15 or 30 minutes and try to do it in the morning. And if you live in a region where it's more difficult, try taking cod liver oil, try eating foods that are rich in vitamin D, and as a last resort, take a synthetic vitamin D supplement, because that should be a last resort. People are going to slay me for saying this, but have fruit instead of refined stuff. Okay? Even if you're doing low carb or keto, you can still have raspberries. I've talked about them. Raspberries are so low carb, and they're have an amylase inhibitor, so they don't break down, the sugars don't break down as much. So berries, no matter what, you're fine. Have a quarter cup, have a half a cup, even a cup a day, you're probably fine if you're moving enough. And if you're not doing keto, have 2 cups of good non-tropical fruits. Maybe papaya is an exception, but try to stay away from the pineapples and things like that, and go from the berries whenever you can. Olive oil, okay? Cook in avocado oil and drizzle with olive oil. Use these liberally, okay? If you're gonna have meat, have lean chicken and lean fish, and add the fats with the olive oil and the avocado oil. These fats are heart healthy, and they are attributed to longer lifespan and less cardiovascular disease risk. And lastly, move around. Stop thinking of exercise as this artificial thing, and what I do is called microdosing exercise. Okay, rather than trying to consolidate a 1-hour workout, maybe get 3 or 4 10-minute workouts throughout the day. Pop in and do some push-ups and get a little 10-minute workout in. Move throughout the day. It's just better if you're looking at health span and lifespan. As always, keep it locked in here on my channel. I'll see you tomorrow.